Hi, how's it going? Welcome to the channel, and I am here for my top 3 worst albums that I've heard throughout all of 2019. Now, there's some things I do want to address before starting this list. Keep in mind that, I wanted to do just worst albums of the year in general because, well, before making this list, I initially wanted to listen to a couple pop releases that came out. But I feel like that would be a little biased since, well, you guys know that I'm not really the biggest fan of pop music. So I feel like, I wanted to have a more objective list. So I'm just going to stick to these top 3 worst albums that I've heard of 2019, of course. So yeah, and keep in mind that all 3 of these bands that are listed here I was once a fan of, but they've just fallen off for me these past couple of years, of course. So yeah, this list might explain a lot. So yeah, and we're going to be going from the bottom to the top, of course, what I think is the least worst to the top worst, the one that is just the worst of the year, I would say. So yeah, let's go ahead and begin this list, and we're going to begin with Starset with their latest album, Divisions. Now, whenever I reviewed this album, I did say that this was one of the worst albums it was the worst album that I've heard of 2019. Obviously, that was before I've even listen to the top 2 on this list. And, I feel like, when the fall came around, that's like really when we started to get into, I guess, the worst of the year, because 2019 overall was just a fantastic year for music. There's been a lot of great releases. And, when we got to the fall, I feel like that's really when we started getting into, I guess, the chunk of bad stuff that the year had to offer. This album is without exception. Now, this is at the bottom of the list, of course, so it's not as bad as the top 2. And I think the reason that it's not as bad as the top 2 is because there's at least a few songs on this album that I enjoy, such as Where the Skies End and Diving Bell, which I think are actually pretty good songs. Not amazing or anything, but they're good. I can dig them. But yeah, the album as a whole is just very poppy. It's easily Starset's worst album. And it's just not a very memorable album overall. I can't remember this album other than the 2 songs that I enjoy from the album. Where the Skies End and Diving Bell, which I think are pretty good songs. Now, I know that there's some fans out there that do say that this is, within the best albums of the year, but I mean, if we're honest here, those are just people that are, Starset fanboys, and, they're not really looking at the music objectively. They're just looking at the band that put out the music, So that's something that I feel like a lot of fans need to keep in mind, because, well, if you think that, this is one of the best albums of the year, then you've clearly missed a lot of great stuff that came out in 2019. I'm just going to tell you that right now, especially in the first half of the year. And even last August, I feel like last August had a lot of great albums to offer, such as Tool, Slipknot, Killswitch Engage, how could this album even top those, But yeah, Starset's latest album, Divisions, I mean, once again, it's Starset's weakest album, and I'm saying that objectively as well. I know there's a lot of people that would agree with me on that. It's just very poppy. That's like really the biggest thing about it. Now, I know Starset's always kind of had a pop sound to them that combines pop with rock and stuff like that, but I feel like with Divisions, they really took it a step further, and it doesn't work for them. I think that this is a band that does have plenty of potential, though. If this band, would go back to the days of Transmissions, I think I'd be on board for that. But this album, Divisions, it's just not a very good album. It's only really good for a couple songs. But yeah, let's go ahead and move on to number 2. Now, number 2, we got Coldplay with their album, Everyday Life. Now, I initially wanted to do a review on this album, but I just decided, I'm just going to talk about it on this list. So that's what I'm going to be doing. So if you guys don't know, I have had a history with Coldplay. They were a band that I was obsessed with back in late high school. I used to love albums like X and Y, Rush of Blood to the Head, Viva La Vida, albums like them that are still their best work, I think. But yeah, I was actually pretty surprised to see Coldplay was coming out with another album, since, you know, Chris Martin came out and said that A Head Full of Dreams would probably be the last album from the band, which was their last album. And that album overall wasn't very good at all. So I really didn't have the best high expectations for this new album, Everyday Life. I will say that this album is probably their best, at least since Ghost Stories. I do think this album is better than A Head Full of Dreams. I'm actually kind of pleasantly surprised about that. I actually thought, you know, this album would be a lot worse. You know, I did not like the singles to this album whatsoever when they came out for the album, but yeah, this album is just, it's still not very good. You know, even if it is better than A Head Full of Dreams, I still don't think it's a good album. In my opinion, the last great album from Coldplay was Viva La Vida. I might even make an exception for Ghost Stories, because there's a few songs on that album that I really like. But yeah, this album, Everyday Life, is just not very good. Now, there is a couple songs that did pleasantly surprise me that I actually did really like on this album. I really liked, what was it called? I liked the song Church, and the title track, Everyday Life. I can't remember which of the two it was, but one of these songs gave me a vibe of their album X and Y, which I thought was a very good thing. I was like, holy crap, you know, because I do remember, you know, one of those songs being one of the first songs I heard on the album, and I was like, holy crap, are they, you know, taking it back to the roots? But no, that's not the case at all. They're taking it, and this is one of those albums that I really wouldn't consider a pop album either, other than a few songs, of course. And that's kind of been my problem with Coldplay, you know, recently, and the last few albums that they had to offer. I mean, their sound has just become very pop, but this album has more of a haunting feel to it, almost like Ghost Stories Part 2 or something. And that's, while I think a pretty unique concept, I like the concept of this album, but I don't know. It's just a pretty bland and generic album. There's some of these songs just sound like gospel, you know, kind of church worshipy, you could say, type music, which is not really my thing. So yeah, this album is just not very good. I mean, I don't know what Coldplay was really thinking with this album, and I don't know. It's just not a very good album. I think this is one of their worst albums. I do think it's better than their last album, but even in saying that, I don't think it's that great of an album. So Coldplay with their album Everyday Life, it had to be on the list. So yeah, it's only really good for a couple songs, just like with Starset's latest album. But let's go ahead and move on to number one, the worst album of 2019, in my opinion, that I've heard. Probably the worst metalcore album of the year, the worst metal album of the year. I have reviewed it on my channel. You guys probably already know what it is. And that is The Devil Wears Prada with their album, The Act. Now, some of you guys actually might be very surprised that I have this album as the worst, even above Coldplay and Starset. You know, because some people might be like, oh, a metal band. You know, a metal band being the worst of the year? Really? That doesn't sound like Zach D to me. But you have to remember that, you know, I'm not just like all metal and, you know, screw all rock music and screw all pop music and stuff like that. No, it's just, you know, like I said, this is an objective list, you know, and I would not just consider myself a metalhead either. I'd actually consider myself a rocker as well. I consider myself both, because I enjoy both about equally, to be honest. So don't just, you know, think that I'm all metal, you know. And it's kind of surprising that this would be the worst of this year, since this is the metal album on the list. But it is, in my opinion, the worst album that I've heard all year. I mean, this album is just, there's nothing. There's nothing that I like on this album, and that's why I consider it the worst of the year, in my opinion. Now, like I said in my review for the album, I did give an exception to the song Numb, but even in saying that, I still haven't returned to the song since release date, or close to release date, or something like that. Yeah, I'm not really the biggest fan of this album. This is easily the Devil Wears Prada's weakest album. I don't know what direction this band is going in, but it's just not very good. I mean, this new vocal style that Mike Haranica has, this style that he's kind of had since 818, I don't know. It's just so lame to me, and he sounds too whiny. And now 818, I think, is still a pretty good album. But I feel like everything after 818, the band has just really fallen off. I mean, Transit Blues was decent, not great, but I think it's decent. And then this album, The Act, I mean, this is easily their weakest album. I mean, there's not a song on here that I can see myself coming back to. I mean, this album also features some of the worst songs that the band had to offer, such as Chemical, and Please Say No. Please Say No is just a cringe. It's just a cringe fest. That's all I can really say about it. I mean, it's just awful. The lyrics, generic, bland. This album is just, I don't know. There's just nothing great about the album. It goes from being cringeworthy to edgy to just, being just bland and uninteresting, And it's easily the worst album that I've heard throughout all of 2019. Now, I still, get some heat from my review for that album. But like I said with Starset fans, I feel like there's a lot of Devil Wears Prada fans that just might defend the album simply because it's the Devil Wears Prada. They don't love the album, they just love the band. And I cannot stand fans like this. But that's what I have to place at number 1, The Act by the Devil Wears Prada. I think it's the worst album that I've heard throughout all of 2019. Well, there you go, guys. That is my list of the worst albums that I have heard all of 2019. This is the top 3. So, yeah, let me know what you guys think. Are there any albums that you can think of that were probably the worst that you've heard all year? Now, like I said, I wanted to stick to just these 3 albums because I wanted my list to be objective. That's why I didn't want to include any pop music or anything. Because, simply because it's pop music, I just don't want to hate on it simply because it's for the sake of it being pop music, And the reason that I have listened to all 3 of the albums that were on my list is because, like I said at the beginning of the video, I was a fan of these bands at one point, so I was definitely curious to see where these bands would go with their upcoming releases. So that's why I had to make this list. So let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day. And take care.